With that, I'm going to go ahead and start today's conversation. We are working, as you all know from our last conversation, to put together a number of panels in response to a lot of the questions that have been surfaced by our discussions. Carrie is now in the process of speaking with, I think it's approaching 100 different people that have been identified by members of the subcommittees, the task force, and some of the staff in the Lieutenant Governor's office and Representative Ortiz. So we're speaking with all of those folks and lining up several panels for our May 4th meeting. What I want to do today is use our time to really drill into what types of questions you would like to ask these different panelists. The three panels that we're going to spend our time talking about today, panel number one will be running for and serving in elected office. And I'll talk about who we're looking to have join that panel, and we're going to want your thoughts on the specific questions or information that you'd like to gain from that panel. Panel number two will be about employment in government agencies. Panel number three that we'll be talking about today will be public discussions and communications. We have a fourth topic to address, and we're not going to dig into it today because I want to have a dedicated conversation, and that's around accessing government services. And on that note of accessing government services, there's a particular issue that has been highlighted by a member of this subcommittee and a member of the executive committee. And I'm going to ask Chanda to speak a little bit about that later in today's call, because I think it's important for this group to be aware of the issue being raised. We will have some dedicated conversation to dig into it, but I want to put it on everybody's radar today. With all of that said, before I dive straight into the panel discussion, does anybody have any questions about what we're hoping to accomplish today? I'm not seeing or hearing any questions just yet. And as a reminder, I think we may have a few members of the public here. We do ask that members of the public, we welcome you being on the call. We ask you to leave your camera off until it's time for public comment. We will at 4:15 have time set aside for public comment. I would just ask that you shoot a message. This is the one time I'll ask you to use the chat, that you shoot a message to Carrie Steele or to myself, Barrick Abramson, letting us know who you are and that you'd like to participate in public comment. With that, I'm going to open up our conversation about the panels that we'll have coming up. And the first one is about running for and serving in elected office. And I know we've got one member who usually joins us, Councilman Hine, who has raised some of the challenges he's faced. In our earlier discussions going back to February, folks identified a number of challenges, whether that's the process of collecting signatures, getting on a ballot, campaigning, participating in debates, and everything associated with actually running for office. And then folks identified challenges with actually serving in office, and whether that's the physical building, whether that's challenges that may exist or barriers to communicating with all constituents, or being able to be involved in all aspects of serving in elected office. To help us dig more into this, we're talking right now, as I said, Carrie's got dozens of conversations with folks, and we're working to identify people that serve in elected office at all levels, from state officials to city and county officials, from big cities to our small rural towns, from liberal to conservative to everywhere in between. We want to make sure that you all have the opportunity to hear from people that serve in elected office or have sought to run for elected office in a variety of contexts. What I want to do today is really dig into what would you most like to ask them? What is it that you would personally like to learn from a panel of people who have either run for or thought about running for office, maybe served in office? What is it that you would like to learn? Or maybe what is it that you think this whole subcommittee would benefit from learning? So I'm going to invite you to be as specific as you can by saying, hey, Barrick, ask them this very specific question, or hey, I think we want to generally find out X. And as I typically do, I'm going to go around in order of people on my screen. So it may or may not pay for you to show up a few minutes early, because that puts you top left on my screen, which means, Karen, I'm going to call on you first, and then I'll be going to Craig. And the question is on our first panel that we're developing, of people who have or have thought about running for office, whether they were successful in getting elected or not. what is it you think we need to ask them? And what would you hope to learn from that kind of panel?
Absolutely. I feel like we need to be asking them what are those barriers to entry? Not only in just knowing what to do, who to contact, but what are the issues around getting signatures or just even being able to get on the ballot in the first place. And then in addition to that, so obtaining signatures, I think, is a big one. And then I think a big one is being able to communicate with constituents, because we've talked a lot about just, door knocking and communications in general. There's a lot of barriers, whether it's in person or online.
Thank you, Karen. Craig, and then Shannon, please.
Hi, everyone. This is Craig. Yeah, I definitely agree with Karen where I'd like to start with just asking about the barriers experienced. And depending on the panel members, I think if there are individuals that have run and are currently in office, I would like to ask them especially about their experience with just the culture of that role. And I would love to ask them about their experiences with ableism in their role and in different levels too, whether it was covert, overt, or systemic ableism in the role. And that's from kind of the beginning of the process of campaigning all the way to serving in political office, kind of how ableism has affected that experience and maybe shaped it.
And Craig, I appreciate that. And I don't want to project or assume anything. So if you could make sure that I'm clear, when you say their experience with ableism, are you referring to voters and constituents? Are you referring to other elected officials or people within the election system? Or is it yes? I just want to make sure that I'm representing your question well as we put these panels together.
I would say, as I was asking that question, I was kind of focusing on kind of the system itself. So other elected officials that they're dealing with, maybe at the Capitol or running against or having to legislate with in that role, or maybe during campaign events or debates, and really the ableism, like built-in ableism within the culture of politics. So not necessarily with constituents or voters, but with the system that they're trying to become a part of and participate within. And how that in itself is a barrier in addition to the physical barriers that we talk about.
Great. Thank you, Craig. I appreciate letting me clarify that. Let me go to Shannon and then Chanda. Jody, we are not getting your audio. If we can pause 1 second.
Can you hear me?
We've got you now. Thank you.
Okay, so this is Shannon. Let me just start over again. Thank you. I would say that I agree with Karen and Craig and everything that they had said so far. But my question would also be, as far as the barriers, how would we solve that? What's the workaround? Because what's happening right now isn't successful. We need to figure that out. And trying to understand how to solve that from we just kind of have to expand that concept and not have that mentality of good enough, but specifically what it is with the barriers. And also at the same time, not just campaigning, but Craig is right with the ableism, how to have that community approach and, what the difficulties are when they're running for office. And I don't feel like the approach is all about winning, but where they stand in the community as well.
Thank you, Shannon. Shanda, a panel of people talking about running for and serving in an office. What would you like to learn, or what do you think your colleagues on this subcommittee need to hear or ask them?
Yeah, thank you. I'm off camera because I'm on my phone today, so apologize in advance. Chanda Hinton, the barrier component is definitely what I'd like to hear, and getting a little bit more specific, like campaigning. How did people navigate through the door to door, knowing that accessibility to door might not be a reality? Also, when you go to door, how do you communicate? And then the other piece is, did some of campaigning and fundraising have any level of, I know we have the buy-in program in the state, but at any level, did any of that fundraising affect anyone's current benefits? So I'm thinking about how an individual cannot, have a campaign affect their benefits. And then thinking of those specifically, I would say that I would want to know what resources they were able to tap in to address some of those specific barriers, and whether those resources were then identified by being available through the state. Did they have to raise extra money to then fund those resources to then successfully campaign? Those are mine specifically that I thought of. Thank you.
Thank you, Chanda. I'm going to ask a second question on this topic. And Craig, I'm going to come to you first. And after Craig, I'll go over to Karen. And the question is this. Right now, Carrie and I had a lot of referrals to people who either currently or in the past served in office or have run for office. We've also got some outreach to the Secretary of State's office, who oversees at the state level our elections. Are there other voices, whether they're political parties, local election clerks, local political activists, or other people involved, or other folks who are not disabled who serve in elective office? Are there other perspectives that you would like to see on this panel in addition to individuals who have run for office?
This is Craig. I think those are the main individuals that I would be interested in hearing from. And I wonder if it would be possible to locate individuals that, I don't know how we would do this, but that were maybe deterred from running from office and vocal about it due to these barriers, because I think those are voices that are sometimes overlooked, because the people that are successful in being able to overcome these barriers may not be experiencing them the same way due to different factors within their life and different access to resources. So if we could potentially locate individuals that were deterred and unable to, for various reasons, would be very helpful to understand kind of why that choice had to be made to stop running and going through the process, and it wasn't due to something built into the system that was that deterrent.
Thank you.
And then I had one more thought as well, where we talk a lot about kind of physical barriers, especially with the buildings where these offices are held, such as the Capitol. Maybe it'd be good to talk to someone that is an expert in renovating buildings or universal design that could give us some insight on what it would take to make these spaces accessible. And maybe are we looking at this wrong, and maybe these big buildings that are ornate and old with marble stairs everywhere, maybe they need to be just museums to show our history, but we create new spaces that are universally designed and welcoming for everyone, instead of trying to retrofit these old spaces that are traditionally looked at as barriers. And so maybe some perspective on universal design and what it would take to make these spaces accessible, and is it even possible in using the infrastructure we have now, or do we need to build something new that is built accessible from the ground up?
Some great suggestions there, Craig. And I will tell you, we've had just some examples of, hey, I know somebody. So we're trying to find those kind of people you suggest who thought about or aspired to run for office and didn't. If anybody on this call, either members of the subcommittee or folks listening on the YouTube channel know of folks, I would invite you to send those names, if not introductions, to Carrie and me. We'd love to reach out to them. And Craig, to your point, I think we will try to track down some people who are knowledgeable on universal design and see if we can't also find some folks who are the facilities managers and are responsible for these and see if we can't get some ideas from some of them. Karen, let me come to you on thoughts of the obvious ones are the people who ran for office and have navigated it, or the people who oversee the elections. What other perspectives will be helpful to us, not just identifying barriers, but making practical, aspirational, actionable recommendations?
Well, first of all, I love what Craig said about how do we either renovate the space. I know, obviously, based on Representative Hines, they had to renovate the space in Denver for him. I know that we need to renovate our space in Thornton, and we don't even provide ASL interpretation at this point in time. So, I mean, there's so far to go. But I actually know somebody in my city that probably would run, but has a hard time because she's hearing impaired. And so I'd love to have you speak with her. I'll be sending in her information. But I'm also wondering if people like Representative Ortiz might know people who had thought about running and never had run because of the issues. I would assume that people have reached out to him and said, oh, wow, I'm so impressed that you did this. I've thought about doing that, and maybe I didn't want to because of all these issues. So I think some of the people that you might speak to about being on the panel might know of other people that didn't run or started to run and maybe stopped in process because of the issues they ran into. And also I was thinking that you could reach out to the state parties, the state Democratic and the state Republican parties. They might know of people that didn't run because of some of those issues. And I would assume the Secretary of State may know as well.
I appreciate that. And we will make that ask. And so you all know, I have also extended an invitation to both state parties if they would like to join the conversation about their processes. I didn't give you a heads up, Chanda, but I'm going to go to you next and then over to Shannon with thoughts of who else besides those who have run for office would you like to hear from?
Yeah, this is Chanda Hinton again. And so one of the things that just came to my mind was maybe someone that can kind of outline what the requirements are when running, as well as some of the because I know that with Councilman Hines, the reason he had to pull himself up onto the stage, like, I think that with all that being said, if we could kind of have a 101 on what's required, I think that might allow us to get ahead of some of these things that feel or are a little bit barbaric still. And so I think that could give us some really good intel on some requirement things that we need to adjust and change, because I think that would then set up success for those that do want to run, knowing that there's still those level of barriers. But I think if we don't look at the requirements to run components, or those might we've got to look at those simultaneously. And so I don't know if there's any sort of, I wonder, I can't think of the entity, but I'm sure you guys can, but there's got to be an entity that can give us a 101 crash course on what those requirements are.
I have a couple of ideas in mind. I do also want to clarify, when you say the requirements, are you referring to the technical requirements, like you must submit signatures or be nominated by caucus, you must appear on a ballot, the things that are legally required, or are you interested instead or also in what are the requirements or what are just the elements of running a campaign for office? What does that require you to do?
Yep. Great question. I would say both, because I think that those concrete kind of legal requirements, I don't think that, because wasn't it a requirement for Councilman Hines, that he had to somehow be up on that stage, right? That was a requirement. Had that, I mean, and for me, it's kind of like, wait a second, why wasn't, if that's a requirement, why wasn't there accommodation in that moment? And so I think that that's really important to see the difference between what might be legally required as well as just some of the, because I know Representative Ortiz has also done kind of a 101 on how to run. And so I'm kind of making sure that we have both of those pieces where it's like the subjective, but more the very concrete, like things that are gonna be legal barriers that will set those boundaries in place for much beyond and then the resources won't work if there's some sort of legal barrier. So that, does that make sense a little bit more?
It does. It makes a ton of sense. And what it has me thinking is a little bit of a elections 101 from a county elections clerk or somebody from the Secretary of State who can talk about what is technically and legally required. And then either a candidate or we certainly know a number of political consultants who can talk about, practically speaking, what's involved in everything from fundraising to media appearances to debate to house parties and meeting voters. So I appreciate those pushes.
Yes, that's great, because that gives us that bigger picture that might then pop out these barriers that we're not thinking of, right? Thank you.
Thank you, Shanda. Shannon, your thoughts on who else you would like to hear from about this process?
Thank you. Well, I know of someone who was running, but I know it's possible to get up on the level of the job, like county, state, city, whatever office. Those barriers are political. So I know a few names through the years and in the system that would apply, but I'm not sure about the political area. So, secondly, I want to catch up on what Chandra said, the requirements are. Do we get on the ballot, like 300 people sign the ballot? And then do people go in person? Is that a barrier because they can't get into the building? And they can't like get their hands on the actual ballot? So is that something that needs to be worked on? Or should we create a website or have a different option of people to run? That could be something. We could do that.
Mary, excuse me for jumping in. I just want to point out really fast to you and to Barrick, it'll be very different for each type of office they're running for. So city council versus school board are very different ways of getting on a ballot than it is to run for the Colorado House or Senate or for maybe an Adams County commissioner. So when we're talking about all of those areas, we're going to need to be very specific as to all of the different types of places you can run and how to get there.
I think that's a great point, Karen. And what we will do is look to present on the different paths to put a name on the ballot, as well as what the number requirements are based on the number of votes for the office that is being sought. So I appreciate you flagging that, because a House or Senate seat is much different from a city council, and even the House and the Senate are different. So we'll make sure that we distinguish the paths and the different number requirements there. Shannon, apologies for speaking, both of us, but while you were going, so floor is back to you.
Oh, no, I'm good. I'm finished. Thank you so much.
Okay, wonderful. I appreciate everyone. I am going to move us to the next panel, but if you have additional thoughts here, we will be contacting and kind of prepping all of these panels in advance of our May meeting, when we'll be having all of these folks join us. So if you think of additional questions, reach out. I will also send an email with that reminder. The next panel we're working to put together for you is around employment in government agencies. We're talking with several folks at different levels of government who work in state government and can speak to the personnel or human resources policies that are in place, including some of the ADA compliance officers. We are also looking to speak to people who are individuals with a disability who are or have been employed in government. For full transparency, that second part is a little bit of a challenge because government cannot disclose people's medical issues or items without their approval. So we don't have a rush of government offices working to say, here are a list of people we employ with a disability. I say all of that because if you know individuals who have applied for, currently work, or previously worked in government and would be open to talking about their experience, we would love to speak with them and make that introduction. With that said, I will first ask the question of who else should we talk to? As I said, right now we've got introductions to some folks who work in government or previously did, and we've got some introductions to people who work on the human capital, the human resources, and the ADA compliance side. But what other perspectives do you think would be helpful to understanding barriers to being employed in government for Coloradans with disabilities? And Karen, I'm going to start with you and then go to Shannon.
It's a tough one based on everything you've already brought up. You know, obviously HR department's going to be our best bet, but maybe if we spoke to someone in training, that might be helpful as well. Just because after they're hired and they're getting trained, I'm sure there's things that come up, and possibly the IT department, maybe.
Interesting suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Shannon and then Craig. Who else other than employees who have a disability who are employed in government and those who are in the hiring process or ADA compliance, who else do you think would help us understand the barriers and the realities day to day of being employed in government?
If you don't mind, I wouldn't mind asking people to share their name, but this is Shannon. And so as far as the Office for the Deaf and Blind and Hard of Hearing, you know, they've been there for almost 20 years and they've seen that nothing really has changed much where, you know, for my community, for the deaf and hard of hearing community, for transparency. And the government has changed a lot in several years and people seem to be satisfied, some not. And hard to say who is satisfied and who's not, but that's it. That's all.
Great. Thank you, Shannon. Craig, thoughts of who else might be a valuable perspective in addition to the individual with a disability themselves who is sought or has been employed, or those responsible for the hiring process?
This is Craig. It's a tricky one because I think those are the main individuals that we would want to get information from, but I also think maybe in employment counselors or job coaches that work with people with disabilities to help understand kind of the work that they're doing and the barriers that they come across while working with individuals with disabilities trying to find employment. And I know that would be tricky to find specific in relation to employment in government agencies, but it would give us kind of a new lens into barriers in general for people with disabilities finding employment, which I think a lot will pertain to jobs in government as well.
Great suggestion. Thank you, Craig. And on all of these questions, just because I ask doesn't mean you have to have an answer. And I know it gets particularly difficult when you're the fourth, fifth, or sixth person in such a smart group. But I'm always going to give everybody the opportunity to speak. Chanda, do you have thoughts of additional roles or perspectives or people that you'd like this group to hear from about the employment question?
Yes, this is Chanda. I would like, I apologize, I always lean towards this level of like requirements, but I do feel oftentimes folks with disabilities that are maybe heavily involved in the advocate community, they often might find that they gravitate towards being employed in government just because we often know a lot, and so we want to be a part of the integral changes that are occurring. And so I'm wondering if there's from HR, if there's a level at which how do folks that maybe are in the advocate community, what restrictions do we have? Like we know that like what restrictions come upon us when we are brought in as an employee of government, meaning like what are the things that because we know that they're there, right? Like we know that and it's okay. Like so for example, our amazing Josh Winkler, right? So what kind of areas, like he's been an amazing advocate, right, in our community there through Colorado Medicaid, has done a lot. So I think that I just want to kind of be mindful of like, but what was there anything that he maybe had to give up, or is there anything that he had to remain or refrain himself from that would then unfortunately kind of I'm sure you have to make the decision, but I think knowing those components that we have to refrain from if we choose to go into government employment just as advocates, I think that is a component that is really powerful for us to know about. So that would be what I would like to see pulled out of some information.
Thank you, Chanda. And I'm going to use that to pivot to the other question for this panel around government service or excuse me, government employment and being employed in government. If you were in my seat and you were the moderator writing the questions, and Karen, I'll go to you first, and then Craig, what questions would you like to ask either someone with a disability who has worked in government or someone in government who is responsible for the interviewing, the hiring, the onboarding, and the training process?
I guess for me, I'm wondering for the people that are hiring, I'm not sure what's legal to ask, what's not legal to ask. And then what are they prepared to do in order to make sure that this individual is given the same opportunities as everyone else and that they get whatever they need to be successful in their role? That's all I can really think of on that one.
I think that's direct and to the point. Thank you. Craig and then Chanda. Craig, what questions would you like to ask either the individual seeking employment or working in government or the people responsible for hiring and supporting them?
This is Craig. I think for questions for the people who are doing the hiring, I would like to ask them about kind of what equitable hiring practices they have, or if they have any, or if they've heard of that term before, and about just the accessibility of the process, and are people aware of their rights? Are they offering reasonable accommodations to individuals and making it clear that it's their right to have those? I would also be curious to ask them where they're posting job opportunities and who makes those decisions and why. I would be curious to know more about how they determine prerequisites for different jobs, and if they continue to look at those to see if they're warranted and needed and appropriate for positions and not just putting the same ones on every job. And then I would also be really curious about how they are valuing lived experience of individuals. as opposed to just credentials.
Great question. Thank you, Craig. I'll go to Chanda and then to Shannon with this question of whether it's the individual employed or seeking employment or the people involved in the employing and hiring and supporting. What would you like to be able to ask them or have them walk this subcommittee through? All of this with the reminder that this is for us to make recommendations to build a better Colorado, to have a better system for all Coloradans. So with that goal, Chanda, what would you want to ask them?
It would be the same question for both of them. So this is Chanda, sorry. What did they have to either sensitively navigate through together, knowing that the person was hiring, yes, the individual wanted to take the position, but what did they have to navigate through together that they either had to do some sort of workaround or it was a sensitive topic as it relates to this process for folks with disabilities to be able to take a government employment position, because and that might be a little difficult to get out of folks in case they may not want to expose or express like some things that may be, but I think it would be great because otherwise if we don't get that expression, we won't know what to fix. But I feel as though that if we could get someone to kind of share that, it will show some maybe old processes that don't need to have that workaround or navigation and can be updated.
Great point, Shanda. And I will also put out to the group, this is part of the careful line we're having to walk of finding people. I hope you all know I'm certainly not afraid of asking the difficult questions. I also want to make sure this doesn't feel like a gotcha for anybody who is willing to join us, that this really is about all of us wanting to learn. That said, if you know people who used to work in government and maybe a little more comfortable talking about their experience, I would welcome those introductions as well. Shannon, to you, same question. Whether it's the individual with a disability who wants to, does, or has worked in government, or the people hiring them, what would you want this group to be able to ask them or learn from them?
I guess I have some questions for each one. The people who are working in government already, my first question for them would be, what type of form or bias do you have set in place in the system, in the department, that, you know, for your work? Because oftentimes it's sometimes not known until then it's disclosed and having to ask. And then as far as HR, when they focus on the hiring, do they focus on? So do they focus on the exit interview for those that are leaving and ask them why? Because, you know, is it a discrimination thing? Is it the boss ignoring them? Is it, you know, is it preventing them from doing their job? Is that why they're leaving? And that's why we're losing them? So that's another thing that I'd like to focus on, is what's causing them to leave the government in the first place. So
great points. Thank you, Shannon. Before I move us on to the third panel, which we'll talk about participating in public discussions, does anybody have any last points for today that you'd like to raise, thinking about the discussion we'll have with panelists on working in government? Shannon, please.
I have something. This just popped up. So I do notice. So for vocational rehabilitation and also for our WIOA office, can't remember the right wording for the acronym, but those both, I've worked with them before and with people looking for employment. And the problem with that is that they have, you know, their level of skill and is a little low. And I've noticed that in government, it's more of a higher level type position. And so needing a degree or a certification, and if they're looking for a job, they're not qualified for those positions sometimes. So the question for them would be, how can it be, how can you accommodate people with disabilities that have the, depending upon their skill level, whether they can get a job or not, because it's been frustrating for them in that regards.
Great. Thank you, Shannon. Some good additions there. Anyone else want to offer thoughts on the employment and government agencies panel? Okay, the door remains open, or certainly my inbox remains open. So if you have additional thoughts, send them our way. This will be but one panel event that we do. As we've talked about several times, we're going to present multiple pathways for stakeholder engagement. And I know that term gets used so frequently, it tends to not mean much. We want to have authentic engagement and the opportunity for people to share their lived experience as an individual and as a professional. So we're going to work with all of you to not just be able to ask the folks on this panel, but to put these questions out to the general public and to the networks that you all know. So as you think of questions, think not just of these few panels that we'll do, but also the broader audience, and think of where you may be able to help us spread those words. With that, I'm going to move on to a discussion of our third panel. And as a reminder, it's rooted in one of our charges, which is to develop recommendations to ensure Coloradans with disabilities are able to effectively participate in public discussions. And on this topic, we've got some conversations scheduled with communications and community engagement folks from different levels of government. With a lot of, as it is with a lot of these, not everyone is eager to jump onto a call with us and tell us how their town may do things not ideally. But we've had some folks that are willing to talk. We're also looking to talk with some people who are professional communications experts. But I'd like to hear from all of you when it comes to the topic of being able to not just participate, but meaningfully and effectively participate in every form of public discussion, from a legislative hearing to a town hall meeting, from a city council discussion to a local parks and rec meeting to talk about the future of their plans. Who would you like to hear from so that we can be more informed of what barriers exist, what bright spots or exemplars exist, and what recommendations you all may want to put together this summer to ensure that every Coloradan with a disability can easily participate in public discussions. And Shannon, I'm going to pick on you first, and then I'll go to Chanda. Who would you like to hear from to talk about what does it really look like to participate in a public discussion?
I'm not really 100% aware of who it may be. They're wonderful, many wonderful, intelligent people. And the situation might happen, it might be boring. And those kind of people want to come because they've seen things, they know how things work, but they really don't listen. So one big part that I'm aware of a meeting with open discussion is where that's happening. I noticed the host will have a list, to help people, like more of like they may overlook some people. It's really designed for local. And people don't really have to think about A, B, C, and D. They just show up. And they already are guaranteed to have accessibility. So that's one of my thoughts. I think it would help to show something like that. Like the function between the meeting and the community.
Thank you, Shannon. Shanda, what types of people do you think would be helpful for us to hear from when it comes to identifying barriers or best practices and ideas that you all may want to consider as recommendations to ensure true accessibility to public discussion at every level of government?
So I am thinking of two particular, and I know you've mentioned, you had a list of some folks already, but what comes to my mind is, we often have planners that put together these public events. And so I would just love to see, is there like a general practice that these planners, like have an existing checklist, right? So it's kind of like, hey, we're putting on this public event within the county, and like you would, I mean, wedding planners, they have checklists, right? So I'm assuming that public events have to have some level of checklist. And I'd love to see that checklist just how it is as of today, and have maybe those planners share just an authentic one that is today, to see to what level are they really looking at accessibility, and what recommendations we might be able to provide them as to what's missing from that, or maybe not only what's missing, maybe something's on there, but it's not described in a way that really is going to address the barrier that's going to come up. So that's one thought I had. The other thought is to really identify, even with our government entities, especially, with the department, like we constantly have advisory committees, and we have public comment at our advisory committees. And I'm curious to see, has the department, HICPUF or other entity that might be overseeing those various entities, have they identified some sort of standard checklist as well? Because I know oftentimes there, just recently I was on a meeting where we had to raise our hands if we wanted to make a public comment, and then somebody had put a link into the comment to say you have to fill out this form in order to make a public comment. And I go, oh boy, that's not accessible. So they allowed me to make a public comment. Granted, I absolutely could have filled out that form, but somebody else that was not physically able to would not have. And so that made me think, like, oh goodness, we have so many of these meetings, and I want to know where the standard process that the department has developed, so that way, as contractors do work on behalf of HICPUF's maybe handing over something that says, okay, here's our standard process for inclusivity, and be sure to make sure that these things are there for accessibility, because otherwise people are not going to be able to participate. Those are my two.
Thank you, Chanda. And that makes me think of a couple of things that I'll just reflect on. One, we certainly have some legal requirements, and maybe one of the things we can do is help ground some of the conversations in what the current definitions are of things like basic accessibility and reasonable accommodation, or the communications, and talk a little bit then about how some of these different folks, Chanda, that you're naming, how they interpret those themselves when they're required to do something, how they approach that. And it also reminds me that you have the opportunity to make recommendations in our report later this year at every level and every lever at your disposal. Some of those may be legal requirements that you recommend. Some of them may be best practices that you recommend people do. So I think hearing from all of these different folks and the questions you're raising are great. Karen, let me go to you and then to Craig. Again, we're talking about ensuring public discussions are accessible to everyone. Who would you want to hear from, or who do you think would be a valuable perspective?
Honestly, I think that you need to talk to some of the constituents who come to our meetings. I mean, from a city council perspective, to be honest with you, we have what's called ward meetings, we have community meetings, we have town halls. So sometimes things are virtual, but many times they're in person. And as far as the ward meetings and community meetings, they're held all over the place at all different types of buildings, not necessarily very accessible, whether for anybody, to be honest with you. And I do think that this does need to be put, these don't need to be best practices. I think we need to come up with things that are rule of law that all of the cities need to be following, because otherwise it's not going to happen.
Fair enough. And I appreciate the directness there. Craig, your thoughts on who do we need to hear from to understand either the experience of an individual trying to participate or how these government agencies actually function when they're hosting and convening these public discussions?
This is Craig. I do agree with what everyone's saying, and I think we need to talk to anyone and everyone that's involved in the process and participating. And I think it's really good to know about the current best practices and the accommodations practices and everything that's legally required. But I also really agree with Karen, where we need to speak to the individuals with disabilities that are in the communities who are participating in these discussions, these public discussions, and understand what their lived experience is like through this process and what barriers they're experiencing firsthand, or even the stigma of participation, or just what it's like, why, or people that aren't participating. Or is it because they don't feel like they're being listened to? Have they participated before and been ignored, or the topics, or are their representatives not bringing legislation to the table that actually helps them directly? And I think that would be just as insightful, as well as asking about the, the physical barriers and the process to figure out what's stopping people from wanting to participate more, especially people with disabilities. And I think that'll give us a lot of insight, because I think we can make the process as accessible as possible on paper and write as many laws about what is legally required to make something quote unquote accessible for someone. But if we don't get to the root of why people with disabilities aren't actively participating more in their system, we're still going to not have the change that I think we are looking for long term. So I think we need to look a little bit deeper about what motivates people with disabilities to participate and what prevents them from wanting to be part of these discussions would be very helpful.
Thank you, Craig. And that makes me think two things. One, we will work with all of you and the other subcommittee and task force members to identify and reach out to some folks who may want to join this panel. This also seems to me a prime topic to use. Carrie has talked to you in the past about Engage Dora, the platform where we will be inviting people to share their stories. And I think this would be a great opportunity for all of us for us to ask all of you to help reach out to your networks and encourage people to share their story and their experience of what it was like to try to engage and participate, or Craig, to your point, why some people were dissuaded and turned away from that. Craig, let me bring you back in, and then Chanda, I'll come to you.
Yeah, and I just had one more group of people that I think would be good to talk about. And this makes me think of ongoing legislation right now, where the bill is called Equal Access to Public Meetings, and they're talking specifically about access and what it would take to have hybrid meetings. And I was listening to the House committee hearing and some of the responses of the representatives, and they just kept talking about the people that were against it and voted no in the committee. Even though it passed through appropriations, there still were people that opposed it, and they were saying how they felt that it was good, but they had budget and funding questions, and that seemed to kind of overshadow the needs of the individuals that needed the accessibility. So I'd be curious to talk more to the representatives about how they view these issues, because I think we're always going to hit hurdles when trying to pass progressive legislation for people that want to bring outside factors in that, kind of complicate the process. And it'd be really good to help understand to talk to these representatives who are voting against legislation like this to what more information they need to help them understand the importance and need of the communities and the value that this brings so that they're willing to put funds towards it as opposed to using that as something that's a deterrent.
Thanks, Craig. Chanda.
Yeah, this is Chanda, and mine's leading a little bit off of what Craig just said. So I would be curious to see if there could be, just think of a rural community to say, you know, we reach out and say, hey, when you do your town hall meetings, what do you do in preparation for accessibility? Because I think that'll shed light on some areas, because oftentimes they'll say, well, we don't, no one with a disability shows up. Well, it's like, well, we can't show up if it's not accessible, right? So I think that there could be some things we could learn from there. And then just leading off what Craig said, and he even mentioned earlier around universal design. So oftentimes I would say that when we're looking at creating some, you know, accessibility, again, we're hitting up against budget issues, right? And so I think that one of the examples recently that I heard was that this is not a, but that they had put in a lift so that an individual could absolutely participate. The cost of the lift they were able to get funded, but then the ongoing maintenance and the requirements that are by the state to then oversee the lift was so much so that they actually stopped putting the lift in because of those restrictions. And I was like, oh boy, that was somebody that wanted to make accessibility happen, but then due to this, you know, these ongoing requirements that cost so much, they actually then didn't do it. So that was a huge red flag for me, in the sense of, here we are again wanting to make accessibility happen, but the ongoing. So I wonder if there's any sort of we could look at what accessibility things and what does the state require of these entities when it comes to these modifications, like whether it be a lift, an elevator, like those kinds of things. I think we got to think about, well, what requirements are going to then reduce it, not only for the first cost of it, but the ongoing cost that's associated to it.
Great point. And we've started kind of, you know, we started off the question of who would you want to hear from, and I think that has naturally led us to what would you like to ask them. I want to open that as well to everyone, or other thoughts on your mind. What questions would you like answered? What would you like to learn more about, in addition to what folks are offering already? Shannon, you had your hand up, so jump in with whatever's on your mind.
Two things. Shanda mentioned, that was a good comment, with the continuous cost and the Mythbuster. You know, having it like, oh, that's going to be so expensive for the lift, but really, it's an investment is what it really is. It's not just a repair, it's an investment. And it'll be there for several years. So it's a perspective, and it depends upon what people think. They're like, oh, you can't. And then if you explain why, and you know, that kind of can help change the perspective. You know, that's one thing that we need to do, is become accessible. And you know, and right away they think about the money aspect of it, but really you have to think of it as an investment.
Great point. Other thoughts on questions you would like to ask of any panelist, or other panelists you'd want to include when we're talking about accessing public discussions? And again, I want you to think from state legislative hearings to small rural city councils and everything in between. What would you hope to learn from these discussions, either from those trying to participate or from those responsible for hosting those discussions? And right now, I'm not going to call on anyone, and there's only, I think, 4 or 5 panelists or subcommittee members on, so feel free to come off mute or start speaking. We'll just continue the conversation. Craig, I see your hand up, so jump in.
This is Craig. I think I'd be curious for asking individuals that are putting on these meetings and coordinating these discussions if there is any ongoing outreach happening now to try and engage with stakeholders to identify barriers and see if there's any work that's happening in some department somewhere that's doing stakeholder outreach to try and gain feedback. And maybe some of this work has begun and we don't have to start from scratch if there's already outreach efforts, or if there are outreach efforts, maybe we could give fee or help figure out why it's not working and just kind of see if this has even been tried before, because I would think that this shouldn't be the first time this conversation has been had. And have people tried before? Do they think that this has already been accomplished and that meetings are accessible? And just get more insight on if they've started this process before.
Thank you, Craig. Anyone else want to offer thoughts on the topic of participating in public discussions? Shannon, please.
Craig made me think of something else in regards to, to stakeholders and those that host. Maybe they don't realize that they have funding and resources that can make their event more accessible. And, because they're like, oh, nobody told me that, or, maybe help with that, maybe open their eyes when it comes to those types of things during, with outreach. That, there is funding that can help with that. Because people don't realize that. And they're like, wow, I've been doing this for how many years? And they had no idea. So just kind of to help with that aspect of it.
Great point. So I think there's probably some public awareness that we can elevate, and we can ask people not only what do you do or what do you not do, but why? Why have you not done other things? My hope also is that this is not only an opportunity to identify where things are done poorly, but it's an opportunity to identify some bright spots, where some things are being done well, and where some people have gone above what's required because it's the right thing to do. And maybe we can highlight that to drive change. And whether that's, as Karen suggests, making it a legal requirement that everyone do, or showing what is possible when people decide to do the right thing. I have to share, I was speaking with somebody here in town who was responsible for putting on the ABS celebration parade. And she complained that when they first started doing that, they did nothing to try to make it accessible. That everybody was going to be shoulder to shoulder, and if you were a person with a disability, you simply wouldn't be able to participate. And she pushed, and she pushed hard, and she got the city and county to really change how they did things. And by the time it came for the Nuggets parade a year later, people were lining up to do the right thing and offer even more ideas because they saw something done well. So I know there's a lot of things being done poorly. I hope through all of this we can highlight the good things as well. We're at 4:05. Craig, jump in.
Yeah, this is Craig. That brings up a really good point. I think a lot of the time there are really good accessibility practices on paper and that exist and being practiced, but that doesn't always make it all the way to the stakeholders or the consumers that need it. And I think about accessible voting. There are these amazing accessible voting machines and tactile interfaces that exist and are amazing and allow people to vote independently, and they're great. But the majority of people we speak with in our community don't know they exist. Yeah. So there's definitely a gap between what exists and is available to what actually gets to the individual who's trying to use it. And it's just outreach, and we have to make sure that there's that connection, because you could have the most accessible practices in the world, but if the people who need them don't know they exist, they can't benefit from them. So I'd like to definitely just kind of expand and ask about what's currently happening and what good is going on. And then how do we let the people know who benefit from that actually know that it exists so they can take advantage of it?
Thank you, Craig. I am going to move us on because I want to make sure we have a few other short discussions. A reminder, at 4:15, we do have time blocked for public comment. I know at times I say this and people look around and say, Barrick, there's no public on the call. We do have folks watching on YouTube. I do see we've got a number of staff from the Civil Rights Division as well as from DORA on. We do have a couple of members of the public online. We welcome you listening and monitoring all of these conversations and engaging. If you would like to make any comment for this group to hear, you're welcome to do so in a few minutes. Just drop me a message in the chat or drop Carrie Steele a message and we'll get you queued up. If you're just here listening, we thank you for your interest and for being online for today's call. We've covered 3 panels, and those are the ones we're going to be pulling together for our May meeting. I again invite you to continue to send your thoughts on questions or panelists for those. Whether they're specific people you know and can make an introduction to, or just folks you'd like us to connect with. I do want to be very clear about some panels we haven't talked through today. One thing I want everyone to know about is we're working on a cross-subcommittee panel on the question of transportation, because that has come up in nearly every subcommittee, whether it's accessing outdoor recreation, running for office, accessing government services. So Carrie has taken point and has been talking with folks, everybody from RTD to some of our other public transit, some of the folks at CDOT. So we're going to be putting together a panel of folks to talk about transportation as it relates to all of the subcommittees' works. When we get that scheduled, we'll invite everybody from all the subcommittees to participate in that. The other thing I want to acknowledge that we did not talk about today, and I'm bringing it up because the lack of a conversation is not because of a lack of focus. It's an entirely other topic, and that's accessing government services. One of our charges is to ensure people with disabilities have access to the services they need, and we'll be developing our recommendations. We're going to have a separate focused subcommittee conversation about that. I do also want to invite Shanda into the conversation, and we're not going to get into a discussion of the issue today because it requires much more conversation. But there's an issue that she has raised with me, and we've had the opportunity to discuss a bit. And Shanda, I just want to invite you to share kind of the big picture and how this does fit into our charge to make sure that folks have access to the services they need. And I will highlight, I think it's probably going to be a conversation here as well as in the CATA rewrite subcommittee. But Shanda, if you want to just give folks kind of the 20,000 foot picture of what you and I discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. This is Chanda. Thank you. And high level, because I don't, yeah, like you said, so we are talking about services access of our under government. I think one of the biggest things that we as a committee really want to, and I'm glad that it's a whole separate conversation, but currently right now, we're seeing a pretty significant lack of access for folks with disabilities. Just seeing primary care physicians within our Medicaid model. And so some of that has to do with just, again, financial, not having the ability to have the accommodations, whether it's interpretation, whether it's accessible height adjusted tables, whether it's transferring onto a table. I know I've mentioned it in other meetings. I just think it's critical to be looking at some of the existing statute law regulation around it and finding out where the continued lack of enforcement around ensuring accessible and inclusive and equitable healthcare for folks with disabilities in our own state here in Colorado as a part of this committee, because individuals are being turned away from healthcare. And I think it's unfortunate because as we continue to get pushed away, we're going to have a disability. We're going to have more health disparities within the disability population. So thank you for just letting me give me that high level highlight. And of course, I'll have more to share at a later time, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Shanda. And as you probably get the sense, this is a complex issue. And we as a task force and even this subcommittee are not situated to address all aspects of it. We can't get involved in how Medicaid is actually administered or the healthcare system itself. We're not here to redesign HICPUF. That said, when it comes to access, when there are laws on the book, if there are issues of enforcement, if there are issues of basic access, those are things that we certainly have within our purview to discuss and to make recommendations. I will also say that if there are issues that surface in conversations that fall outside of this task force, we will at least note those for further exploration. So if at any time you find me saying that's an important issue that we're not charged with addressing, that doesn't mean we're dismissing it. I'm perfectly prepared for you to say, Barrick, we want to include this in our report. When Shannon and I talked about this, it took a while for her to really bring me up to speed and educate me. And as she did, it became pretty clear to me that there are at least significant parts of this that are fundamental to people having access to the government services they need. So we're going to have a conversation about this situation. We're also going to have a dedicated conversation as a subcommittee more broadly about accessing government services. So I would encourage people to just give some thought to that in advance of our upcoming meetings. We're going to go to public comment in just about 2 minutes, just to kind of close the loop on all of this. If you have thoughts on questions, if you have thoughts on panelists, send them my way. I also, as you do that, give thought to where there's opportunity to ask these questions of a broader audience, of more constituents, more individuals, more leaders who may be able to offer perspectives of their lived experience with any of this. We'll be doing kind of in parallel the panels and the DORA, engaged DORA stakeholder engagement. So all of that will be happening in the coming 4 to 8 weeks. With that, it is 4:15. It's time for public comment, and I have word that Jenny Jordan has something to offer us. And Jenny, you're welcome to come on camera if you're in a place where it's safe and comfortable to do so. And thank you for joining us today. What's on your mind?
No, thank you all so much. My name is Jenny Jordan, and I happen to work for healthcare policy and financing, specifically in the Office of Community Living, and I oversee supported employment and benefits planning services. But I also have family members with disabilities, and so this is something I think is such important work, and I appreciate all of you putting the time to this and elevating so many of these thoughts. As the meeting was progressing, I had some additional thoughts that I would like to humbly offer for the group to potentially add to some of the questions that you would be asking or people to involve. So first, with the government officials, those who have been elected, asking what their experience was in getting necessary accommodations, how difficult it was, and how much time did it take to get those accommodations in place. I think those questions could also be directed to employees in governmental agencies as well. An additional group to consider with the government employee component is agencies might have affinity groups. As an example, HICPUF does for people with disabilities and mental health. So that might be a way you could get connected to people without, they might have self-disclosed to be part of that group. And so that might be an avenue that you could pursue. A reflection on government employees, again, is I was recently on a national level webinar that was geared towards government employees. And a number of people identified that they had invisible disabilities that they would not have felt comfortable disclosing. So identifying that even though there might be some people in the work, they might not be currently disclosing that. So perhaps having an opportunity for some anonymous or some sort of more shielded opportunities to share that experience in particular, because they might be hesitant because of career growth or not wanting to be looked at or treated differently if they do share this. Related to the public discussion, I apologize if this was already mentioned, but people with digital accessibility expertise So not only what meetings are out there, but how are those meetings being posted? Are there materials after the meeting that are being shared, and what level of accessibility might those written or digital documents have? And I think that covers it. So thank you so much for your time, and again for your putting time and thought to this process.
Jenny, thank you very much for joining us and for offering those comments. We did just have the one person who asked for public comment, which leaves us a little time on the agenda. I'm here to support all of you, so I want to give you the opportunity, if any members of the subcommittee have additional thoughts or want to reflect on today's conversation, or if you have asks of Carrie and me, as we put together these panels, as we get ready for the opportunity for further online engagement with people sharing their stories. What can we do to best support you, or any reflections you'd like to offer about today's conversation? Craig, please.
This is Craig. Yeah, Jenny's comment made me think of another question to ask people that have run for office and that might still be in office, that are people with disabilities, are the additional financial impact that they experience during the process, and if any of that was in relation to accessibility needs. And that takes us back to a point that I know Shannon had brought up meetings ago, where we talked about, how expensive interpreters are, and that it's not practical to just say, well, just bring an interpreter with you as you're going door to door because of the financial cost to that. So I'd be curious to actually get some numbers about that financial impact and those additional financial burdens for people who have run for office, and how they either figured out how to navigate that, or if that was an additional barrier, but to try and get some actual lived experience of what those numbers are like and how impactful that can be.
Thank you, Craig.
Uh,
Shannon.
Sorry. Jenny, go ahead. This is Shannon, but
No, Shannon, please jump in.
okay. So thank you, Craig. I want to dovetail on what Craig was talking about. I know another barrier, maybe mostly people with disabilities who notice they have to be responsible for all the financial things, the financial burden, and that is who should be responsible for that small part of accessibility? Is it us, or the government, or a private donation, or the ADA? I don't know. We need to question, where is the money coming from? Who knows? We need to answer that question and then decide how to act based on the answer to the question.
Shannon, I appreciate you raising that. And this is where I'm going to lean in on you and the members of the subcommittee to ask you who you need to hear from, what you need to learn, what discussions we can facilitate to help answer that. Because the legislation that created this task force didn't answer it. I'm not here to offer an opinion. The charge of this subcommittee is to examine all of the best information we can bring you. And this summer, you're going to have to wrestle with that very question of what should the state of Colorado do? So I appreciate you raising that. I don't know that there is an easy answer. And in that sense, I don't envy all of you, because that's what you're going to have to wrestle with, is making some difficult, bold recommendations to ensure access to everything in Colorado for everyone. So I don't have a specific question for you. I will just continue to push on folks. Let us know what you need to learn, hear, or discuss with your peers to be able to have those conversations this summer and make those recommendations of who should take on what responsibility and to what level. Anyone else have reflections or final thoughts or additional suggestions? Well, seeing and hearing none, I'm going to say something I rarely get to say, which is I'm happy to give everybody a little bit of time back to enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you truly for the opportunity for us to support all of you and for your smart thinking, which I really believe is going to position us to have some great panels, but more importantly, some great discussions this summer about what types of recommendations you all want to put forward. Continue to give thought to what you'd like to learn from the May panels. We'll continue to check in with all of you, and we'll see you 1 month from today. Thank you all very much.